August in England was an intense, brilliantly performed one-man show, played by one of my childhood heroes, the comedian and local legend Lenny Henry. Lenny made us feel as if we were part of his world. He welcomed the audience into his family home and invited us all to have a shot of rum with him while we listened and danced along to the reggae and dancehall classics that were blasting from the theatre speakers. And it felt at times as if we were not just watching August's monologue, we were instead sharing in Lenny's own life story. And so these two worlds overlapped with one another, the play and Lenny's real experience, lived experience. They were closely and intimately tied to, I felt, Lenny's own memories of growing up as the son of Jamaicans in an industrial city, playing in a band with his friends, chasing girls, being the class joker, and getting into trouble at school. And the character he played, August, could have been, and really should have been, any one of us. Just a normal, everyday, hard-working man who had his flaws and made mistakes, just as we all do. Except there was a far, far deeper level to this narrative. In the background, as the audience laughed and sang, there was an underlying sense of foreboding and fear. And a blurred image, which was difficult to make out at first, would intimately flash on and off the screen behind Augustus as he talked us through his life story. The silent figure in the background appeared slowly at first, giving us a sense of unease and trepidation. But as the play progressed and we learned more about August's life, his loves and his regrets, we realised there was something else lurking in his own past. An inescapable and unsettling force was beginning to catch up with his present life, pushing him into an impossible situation that would eventually lead to his incarceration and, we were led to believe, expulsion from the UK, a country he had called his home for decades. So as a son of Jamaicans, August had travelled at a time when his parents' country was transitioning towards independence. He had arrived as an 8-year-old boy on his mother's passport, and she was seeking to reunite with his father, who had settled there many years before and who, just like many West Indians at the time, had the ambition of making enough money to eventually take back to their family in the Caribbean and buy land and restart a life there. And that was the very same dream that August's father had, and thousands of others like him also had shared, but never really materialised. So instead, they found themselves trapped in menial jobs and earning low wages. They were part of the essential group who thanklessly rebuilt the UK after the Second World War, and they became the train drivers, the bus conductors, the cleaners, the National Health Service nurses, the manual labourers, the teachers and carers that all Brits came to rely upon. Life in the so-called mother country, however, was not the dream they were promised, and they faced racism, discrimination and ostracisation at every turn. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. A sign that was all too familiar with many who attempted to build a home and settle in the UK. Now, 75 years ago tomorrow, on the 22nd of June 1948, HMT Empire Windrush arrived at the Tilbury Docks in London. The boat is traditionally and politically remembered as a significant moment in the arrival of post-war Caribbean migrants to the UK. Yet, every single Commonwealth passenger who disembarked at Tilbury and arrived in London came as a British subject, because at that time, any person born in the UK or its colonies was effectively a citizen. So subsequent changes, so for example, the introduction of the Commonwealth Immigrants Acts of 1962 and 1968, as well as the Immigration Act of 1971, and numerous further restrictions and changes to the law were purposely implemented then to block the rights of people from new Commonwealth countries. And for years, people of Caribbean heritage were reporting problems over their right to remain in the country, that they were having issues, and nobody was listening. So I recently visited the George Padmore Institute in London, where I spent hours avidly sifting through old copies of the community newspaper, the Caribbean Times. And the publication began around the same time the British government had begun implementing its 1981 Nationality Act. This controversial bill was passed over after 150 hours of debate in Parliament, and it induced fear in the communities of the time, as evidenced by the public meetings, the rallies, the focus groups that were organised by grassroots organisations at the time and were reported in the paper. The No Pass Laws Here group protested against the passport raids taking place at people's workplaces and homes, and the increased demands on people to produce a passport for inspection at hospitals, in schools and at the bank. The Act removed the rights of tens of thousands of people from the Commonwealth to register as citizens, and it also meant that a person born from 1983 to two non-British parents in the UK would no longer be British, which was a major change to the law. Now, curiously, despite the efforts to better identify supposed foreigners living and working in the UK, the country still doesn't have any official national identification system. And this contrasts with most European nations where an ID card has come to be widely accepted and commonplace. So the national identity card we did have was discontinued after World War II, and in recent years there have been some really heated debates about how the introduction of a new ID system would lead to an infringement of civil liberties such as the right to privacy, as well as enforcing the increased policing and ill treatment of people, including Black and Asian people. So in the mid-2000s, the Labour Party introduced its Identity Cards Act via an Act of Parliament that was eventually repealed in 2011. But what I find interesting in this scenario is that as individuals began travelling to the UK from Commonwealth countries, the documentation they were required to present was, of course, in paper format and was also sometimes non-existent. So children who arrived on the Windrush, for example, did so on their parents' passport. Many had no form of identification and no proof of entry into the country. And indeed, the government stated that it no longer has the landing cards that would have evidenced their arrival. So those who did try and rectify this situation approached the authorities. When they approached the authorities, they were met with suspicion. Registration costs became higher and higher, and thousands of people had no ID card or passport and no way of evidencing their legal status. But indeed, there was also the debate at the time that people who were travelling from the Commonwealth were travelling from one part of the UK to the other. So it didn't matter if someone was travelling from Kingston, Jamaica to Reading in England, they were still within the empire, right? So they were still travelling as British subjects. So this panorama then became increasingly complex. In 1962, I can see the sound as well. Can people hear me? I think there's an echo now. Yeah. Do you want me to continue? Or? Yeah. Okay. So this panorama became increasingly complex in 1962. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became independent, followed by Barbados and Guyana in 1966, Dominica in 1978, and St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 1979, etc., etc. So, as each country transitioned, entry requirements changed, as well as the documents people were expected to travel on. People were expected to approach the British High Commission in their respective countries, if indeed there was representation there, because there were some islands where there was no diplomatic representation, and then were asked to deposit the relevant paperwork in a process that was far from straightforward. So people were often unclear about what their rights were and what paperwork they actually needed. And I think that you could say that the British government was also equally confused about the situation. So as Jamaica began taking the first steps to disentangle itself from its colonial ties, it was also experiencing a long journey of discovery and reimagining of what being Jamaican meant. But many Black Britons of Jamaican heritage had travelled from the Caribbean at a young age with their parents. They grew up singing the national anthem, reciting the works of Shakespeare and Keats, and celebrating the Queen. And Barbados, the first overseas British colony, was labelled Little England. But this idyllic setting of the Caribbean, visited by hundreds of thousands of sun-seeking Europeans each year, harbours a violent past, scarred by a brutal history of people stolen from Africa, forced into slavery, and exploited and abused to produce sugar to enrich Europe. So these pasts are intrinsically linked and intertwined with other people's stories, experiences, and histories. And just like August, people of African Caribbean descent saw themselves and their children as British, were told by the authorities they were British, and had worked their whole lives to rebuild a country devastated by war. And indeed, we shouldn't forget that thousands of them also fought in that war, and their family members died in it. So whatever the political discourse of the time, it is precisely because of Britain's colonial past that legislation was always intended, adapted and restructured to intentionally prevent Black and Asian Britons from full acceptance and integration as citizens. The system, it was a system by design. It was designed to work against them. And as Gominda Bambra and Rieko Karatani have both argued, the British state has implemented specific policies to convert some citizens into immigrants. People who are entitled to recognition as Britons, yet who found themselves battling with the Home Office and entangled within the chaotic labyrinth that is the immigration system. And gradually the state began to purposely truncate the rights of this so-called Windrush generation, incrementally blocking their access to public services, pensions, employment, housing and healthcare. So, fast forward to 2012, and Theresa May's Conservative government is implementing its hostile environment. Go home vans are circulating the streets to tell immigrants that they are not welcome. People are subjected to immigration checks via new immigration acts introduced in 2014 and 2016. Landlords are given increased powers to check people's immigration status, and computer databases are being used to help the National Health Service and other government services identify and begin charging non-nationals for treatment. Those who could not provide evidence of their legal right to remain are subjected to detention and some possible deportation. So the entire logic underpinning the really nasty hostile environment was that the burden of proof had to be on the individual to demonstrate they were living legally in the country. So typically this meant that landlords, employers and government officials were able to demand to see a passport. So going back to what I've said, many literally didn't possess the documents required to prove their right to remain, and the government strategically then also removed any form of legal aid or legal assistance that people could have claimed in 2013, so that anyone with limited financial means were literally left powerless to fight this. So many of those affected were also elderly and were being met with mistrust and suspicion if they approached the Home Office to sort out this problem. And from the research as well we've been doing, that many people were also ashamed and embarrassed to even tell their family members, you know, or their own children that this was happening, for fear that this would then also implicate their family in these problems. So, okay, we now find ourselves back in the theatre audience in Augustus' living room. He's sitting on his sofa when a single letter falls from the ceiling. He opens the letter and reads it. Capita, a private corporation hired by the Home Office to implement a hostile environment, write to August, to question the authenticity of his British citizenship, demanding that he contacts them immediately. Understandably, he's confused. He travelled to the UK with his mother, he has worked his whole life, he has gone to school, and he's gotten married and had children. So, he ignores the first letter. And then as the play continues, more and more letters begin cascading down from the ceiling, landing in his living room. It's quite a powerful image when you're watching it. And these letters are threatening him with deportation and urging him to contact the Home Office. It is relentless. And it gets to the point where August has no choice. At first he's too embarrassed, and then he's forced to ask his daughter for help. And gradually, as she does try to navigate the system, as she tries to navigate this complex, overly cumbersome Kafka-esque system, she too becomes overwhelmed. The authorities are requesting that August provide them with over 40 years of tax returns and paperwork to evidence each and every year that he was earning a living. The blurred image that was flashing behind him becomes more and more prominent, and gradually we were able to make out the identity of the figure who's been in the background this whole time. We see that the image is of August himself, now a broken man whose past has finally caught up with him, sat in a deportation centre, awaiting removal to Jamaica, a country he left as a boy and has not visited for decades. And the play ends with very powerful video testimonies from the people who were the real victims of the hostile environment. And they recount their own tales of horror, detailing how their lives were utterly torn apart, their sense of belonging and Britishness destroyed, and their anger at being caught up with an invisible system that made them powerless to fight the beast that is the British state. The scandal is an extremely concerning example of how people's interactions with a faceless bureaucratic system further entrench discriminatory practices against individuals. And the more a person tried to rectify or address the problem by emphasising their right to remain, the more that system clamped down and worked against them. Now, the question I want to ask today, and it might be somewhat of a leap to the theme of this keynote, but would the Windrush scandal have happened if the UK had had its own national identification system? Would the improved management of a person's legal status have facilitated or exacerbated the negative impact and negative experiences of minority groups, including the threats of deportation they received? Would a better managed, digitised, fully integrated ID network have worked to the benefit of the Windrush generation? Or instead, would it have just exacerbated the surveillance and ill treatment and discrimination of this group? So that's one of the examples of something that as a collective, as a group, that we can start thinking about. So just this week on Monday, with my team, we organised a major conference called the Windrush Scandal in a Transnational and Commonwealth Context, which took place at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London. And some of the guests that we had at that conference included Amelia Gentleman, who was the Guardian reporter responsible for breaking this story and making it front-page headlines in 2018, as well as the former Barbados High Commissioner to the UK, Guy Hewitt, who at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting also used what he terms guerrilla diplomacy as a way of bringing this attention to the British government and demanding that they take action. So this brings me then to the importance of the history of identity documentation in European nations, citizenship, nationality and migration network. Hidden seeks to examine the ways in which identity documentation and the systems used to implement them feature in every part of our lives. It also seeks to bring these stories together to provide a platform to amplify some of these voices and lived experiences. And the study of identity and the role of documentation and the architectures that support them are by nature, and as we heard earlier, interdisciplinary and cross-sectional. So they absolutely demand the input of a wealth of expertise to help us better understand the world we are living in. And this can include historians, migration and citizenship scholars, legal experts, sociologists, geographers, post-colonialists, human rights practitioners, and many more. So I thought what I would do is maybe ask the audience now a quick shout out. Is there any discipline that I haven't mentioned or acknowledged that we have here, that maybe we haven't even anticipated being part of this network? Just shout out. Anthropology. Anthropology, of course.
Demography. Demography.
Demography, wonderful. Who else? Anyone else?
History of art.
Wonderful. Okay, we've had some more. I did have some more up my sleeve. I had, I'm not sure if I just said it, but human rights practitioners, technical specialists, so system technicians, artists, and many more. So I hopefully the list goes on and hopefully we will add to the list as this action continues. So identification is something deeply embedded within every aspect of our political, social, and economic framework. And as I've tried to illustrate with the story I told you today, ID systems in Europe are, and always will be, intimately connected to our colonial histories, our place in the world, and our relationships with one another. They can only be understood when we have a deeper appreciation of how these paths intertwine and speak with one another across a range of contexts and lived experiences. So my own work, as Michael mentioned, is trying to understand the global impact of contemporary digital identity systems, particularly in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, which is seeking to provide a legal identity, a universal legal identity by 2030. And as it currently stands, although I've heard all sorts of figures around this, the figure I'm going to say is around 1 billion people, but this is changing every day. But around 1 billion people in the world have no form of legal existence whatsoever. No birth certificate, no ID card, no passport, and no other form of documentation that verifies their legal status. So the private sector, intergovernmental organisations and states are hailing digital identity as the key tool in providing the world's population with their own unique ID. And as the UK Government Department for International Development stated in 2018, digital identity has the potential to revolutionise the lives of the poor, unlock development and prosperity, and accelerate progress towards the global goals. Digital identity, then, is being held as the solution to overcome statelessness, to facilitate migration management, and to ensure that aid assistance and welfare reach the world's most vulnerable. This is generating big data, storing people's personal information, and it's also contributing to the production of vital statistics, which can be very beneficial to people like us, to researchers and policymakers and academics, who to help us make informed decisions about the populations that we're targeting or addressing, so that we can prioritise the delivery of services, aid interventions and welfare payments. Yet, there is another side to this picture, and my recent book, Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic from Citizen to Foreigner, shares concerns with the scholar Lindsay Kingston, who I can see is online, so just a shout out there, who warns how states can weaponise citizenship to punish, erase and socially control targeted groups. My book explores the case of the Dominican Republic, which shares an island with Haiti in the Caribbean, to illustrate how Dominicans of Haitian ancestry, people who are already in possession of a state-issued ID confirming their status as Dominicans, were retroactively reassigned a new foreign status. The launch of the country's first biometric national identity card 10 years ago was, I argue, central in facilitating the permanent elimination of black Asian-descended people from the country's civil registry. And this is a concerning case of global import because it highlights how digital identity systems are being used to weed out certain groups of people based on their race, their ethnic and national origin. And in parallel to the Windrush scandal that we've seen in the UK, these are individuals who are already living and going about their daily lives as citizens, yet who found themselves embroiled in a fraught battle with the state who was trying to block their access to their documents because the system was flagging them as non-eligible foreigners. We also cannot ignore the growing malaise that we're seeing from grassroots organisations, community groups, privacy campaigners and activists on this issue. A recent report by the Centre for Human Rights and Global Justice at the NYU School of Law, provocatively titled Paving a Digital Road to Health, a primer on the role of the World Bank and global networks in promoting digital ID, warns that we need to err on the side of caution, slow down and reconsider the rapid pace at which the digital ID agenda is now advancing, as well as recognising its potential for widespread harm. And as many of us in this room know and have, I'm sure, numerous examples, history has already shown us very clearly that when states become overzealous, when they are equipped with the tools and infrastructure to discriminate and target specific groups, then the outcome can be disastrous. Nazi Germany, the Rwandan genocide, the human rights abuses against the Rohingya in Myanmar. Thinking closer to home, the recent Dutch childcare benefits scandal, and please excuse my Dutch, the Toslagen affair, is something that I'm also really looking forward to learning more about during my short-term scientific mission to the University of Amsterdam and to the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion in Rotterdam as part of this cost action next month. The e-Estonia initiative is another fascinating case study, as is the European Commission's digital identity strategy to provide all EU citizens and residents with their own personal digital wallet. Now, some of these examples throw a spanner in the works of the claims of governments that digital identity will solve many problems. Others are real success stories and models of progress that we need to examine and understand more closely and learn from and identify which are the examples of good practice. So where is this working, but also where is it failing, and how can we make this better? So let us not forget that there are still millions of people and their families around the world who historically have never held any form of legal identification, and for centuries have been living an entirely undocumented existence. Digital identity is radically transforming that picture. And as I argue, the proliferation of digital identification systems worldwide is an underappreciated revolution. It is bringing people into the formal economy, it's making their interactions with the state more visible, and it's doing so in a way that is increasingly taking the human element out of these processes. So when people find themselves excluded from a database, when they're blocked from accessing essential state and financial services, their lives can be turned entirely upside down. And that's how what I've tried to show with the case of August, is also how people's sense of belonging and identity can be completely challenged and indeed shattered by these experiences. So, as I concluded in my recent book chapter, over the coming years, biometrics and digital technologies will play a central role in the securitisation of all people. They will be used to decide which groups can access state provisions and who ultimately is recognised as a member of the body politic. And as we've explored today, this unfolding and complex landscape is not simply about physical borders or managing the cross-border movement of migrants. What I've really wanted to highlight is that the border is just one of multiple sites where the state can now actively police, threaten, control, and exhaust people at every stage of their existence. So it's in the mundane, in the ordinary, and in the routine that this oppression plays out. It's not enough for citizens to simply have the right to have rights, as Arendt Barber has successfully argued. Looking towards the future, we all need a digital identity to unlock access to those same rights. Now, the hidden network could not have come along at a timelier period in history. The questions it raises, such as asking how we got to this point, if European nations are moving broadly in the same trajectory, and what the ethical and moral implications of ID systems are, I think are all vitally important. And they can only be answered as a collective, by sharing our research, our experiences and our methodologies with one another, as well as looking to, as I've said, amplify the voices of those people whose own experiences are either being silenced or invisibilised. So the central point then is that systems designed to include will always inevitably also lead to the exclusion of some people. And this is a reality. But as long as we identify who this is happening to and accept that ID systems will always hold inherent biases, then and also acknowledge that there's no perfect digital identity framework, but the solutions to overcoming these problems is to try and better understand how states can help or hinder citizens in accessing their ID, to better scrutinise the fundamental shifts we are seeing in this monumentous transition from paper-based to digitally based systems, and examine the implications of these changes to the ways in which identity, citizenship, foreignness, and our own past and family histories are consistently being reshaped, reimagined, and restructured. And this can be via private interests and capital, the state, individual experiences, and much, much more, which I hope we can discuss over the course of the next 2 days. So thank you very much.